Hey everybody, my name is Eric Hayden. This presentation is going to go over a small rose garden with respects to winning big at rose shows. The audience for this is people that have a couple rose bushes, belong to a local society, and think that they could never compete with the people that have hundreds of rose bushes. And that's just not true. The intent of this video is to show you that you don't need a lot of roses to compete in a rose show. So if you have 2 or 3 now and you want to expand to 10 or 15, you can certainly be competitive. And this is also for those that have a lot of roses now that are thinking of downsizing and that they may lose their competitiveness, when in fact a lot of advantages can be obtained by having a much smaller rose garden. At the end, I'll provide my email address, so if you want to scroll to the end and ask any specific questions, just shoot me an email. A little bit of background how I got involved in rose growing was a long journey. The picture of my dad is on the center part of the screen. He was very much into rose exhibiting. He belonged to a local society up in Maryland. He had over 250 rose bushes on a very small suburban lot. So a lot of rose bushes, had all different types of classifications from hybrid tea to mini floras and minis. When he was at the highlight or height of his career as a rose grower, I was a teenager. So I had little interest. The picture on the left of the person digging holes, that's what I felt that I was always doing, because he was constantly moving his rose bushes to better areas in the yard. The wheelbarrow, used a lot when I was back in college on breaks, spreading out mulches and mushroom compost and things like that. And I would help him plant the bushes, but really had zero interest in rose shows. I think I saw 1 or 2 of his shows that he competed in. My primary help was definitely in the garden itself, and that's where I got the green thumb. But when I was a teenager into the 20s, just more interested in growing vegetables and other types of flowers, but not roses, and certainly no interest in rose shows. Flip forward, we purchased our first house, my wife and I, a town called Apple Lake in New York, just west of Binghamton, New York, in 2009. And then by 2012, I started growing roses. If you see the picture on the right, still a lot of vegetables in the yard. I had some Shasta daisies and squash and beans and cucumbers. So still more of a vegetable and other type of flower grower. But the picture on the left shows the first 7 roses that I planted. A bunch of these were from my dad's garden. Bushes like a European Touch, which is a sport of folklore. I had a Spring Break, an Alina, and an Ivory Tower. So I had 4 roses from him. And then I started off with 3 roses that I had ordered. One was a Double Delight and a Mr. Lincoln. I wanted color, I wanted fragrance. I really could care less if it had exhibition form or not. But he convinced me. He said, why don't you have at least 1 exhibition rose if you ever get into it? If you don't get into rose shows, at least it makes a nice cut flower. So I started off with 1 Gemini. Flip forward another year, had joined a local society, got more interested in growing roses, ordered more roses from Palatine Roses. It's up in southern Canada. They specialized in multiflora seedlings that they grafted onto, and that was better for our climate in upstate New York. So that's my son Christian in the upper right, as we're planting some new roses, another bed of 7. This time, I did have some aspirations for rose shows. So I planted more of the exhibition variety. Another Gemini, picked up a Dublin, also Elizabeth Taylor, and also Gold Medal. So started to change toward more exhibition variety, but still quite low on the numbers, just up to 14. Then the rose bug certainly bit. The season 2014-2015 is when I really expanded. The picture in the lower left are the roses that were the original 2 beds, the 14, and they started to become more mature. And then the one on the right is what used to be our vegetable garden. Though vegetables ended up being replaced by roses, and again, the main focus was exhibition. I had already had my Double Delight, and I already had my Mr. Lincoln for fragrance. So now I was getting the Moonstones and the Veterans Honors, Hot Princess, some of those types of roses that were usually in the top 5 or 10 for exhibiting. So the main focus was on that. Things like Marlins Day, Affirm, really focusing in on exhibition. And at 39 roses, you might say that doesn't sound like a small garden. And for the average Joe, that's not a small garden. But people I was competing against in terms of rose shows would often have more than 50, in some cases hundreds of roses in their yard. So anything under 50 is certainly considered a small garden in terms of exhibiting. And that's why this is classified as a small garden, all relative compared to who I was competing against. Now, one of the reasons why you notice that garden expansion through the years was joining a local Rose Society. Cannot say enough about the folks at the Syracuse Rose Society. Joined them in the fall of 2013. I found their society because they had a website and now they have a Facebook page. So for any local societies that are looking to continue growing or to continue to stop the decline that you're seeing, I highly recommend you get involved in social media and you have a website. That's where you're going to find new blood and new membership in the society. It certainly helped that my first show that I entered, if you think back to that first bed I had a Gemini and then I added a second Gemini based on my father's guidance. That won Queen. That's a top prize in the first rose show I entered in 2014. Good friend Andrew Hearn had come up and helped me groom the rose, and he took one look at it and thought it would be up on the court, and he was certainly right. That following August, the State Fair in Syracuse, I won King, which is second place with Alina. So again, some of the original roses my father either gave to me in the case of Alina or recommended that I order in the case of Gemini. In my second year, 2015, I won 5 straight Queens a Show. That's a top prize. That included the Spring Show in Syracuse, also Buffalo and Reading, Pennsylvania, the State Fair Show in August of 2015, and in that particular year in fall, the 2015 National Show was in Syracuse. The lower left is my Moonstone, which won Queen a Show, and the picture on the right shows the Moonstone along with Cajun Moon, which won King or second place. Also made the court third place with European Touch. That was a rose that my father had given me. So 2015, Bitten by the Bug, certainly was by far and still is my most successful year in terms of exhibiting. So what is the point of all of that? I grew roses. My father was into it. I did well in the beginning. It's not just to brag about it, but it's to emphasize that you don't have to be the most experienced rose grower. You don't have to have the most roses. If you join a local society, you get guidance from people that have been doing this many years, and you focus on exhibition roses. Even if you don't have a large quantity of roses, the high quality can certainly put you in the game in terms of exhibiting. So the next couple slides, I want to go over why smaller gardens do have benefits. Obviously, if you have a lot of roses, you have more potential blooms, but there are some factors that smaller gardens are favored. One is cost. In 36 to 38, 39 range in terms of bushes, it's not as expensive. So right now I have 38 roses. I just use the number 36. I typically in the spring put a cup of alfalfa meal, 14-14-14, similar to Osmocote, but it's Wood Ace, rose tone, cottonseed meal, and blood meal. When you multiply that by 30, 35, 40, not nearly as expensive as if you multiply that by 300. So just think, if you're sitting watching this video, you may only have a handful of roses. Think about how much cost benefit it would be if you just had 5, 10, or 15 when you're really trying to feed heavily those roses versus having a lot. A lot of times it comes down to space. I love this picture of kids trying to squeeze into a small space. A lot of our yards, we just don't have the space, whether it's competition from trees, tree roots, large established mature bushes, maybe sun exposure. We may not have an ideal space in a large area in our yard. So with a smaller amount of roses, you don't have to have a huge ideal spot in your yard. You just have to have a small one. Time. Time is a big factor. That's a picture of my wife and 3 younger kids. I have a lot of things going on. Got to cut the grass at some point. I've got two kids in school, one in preschool right now. They do sports, or they've done sports, softball, t-ball, swimming lessons. I'm a meteorologist with the National Weather Service, so I have a lot of things going on. I'm sure you do as well. Less roses, less time that you have to spend on them. They're going to be time consuming regardless. If I'm putting down a cup of organic rose tone once a month and I'm watering and I'm pruning and I'm spraying, you're going to spend a lot of time on it. And it's enjoyable because it's a fantastic hobby. But you can cut that time in half or a quarter if your garden's not huge. So that is certainly a benefit of a smaller garden. Maintenance. I mentioned the pruning and spraying. For those folks watching from up north, I know we have some members from the Pittsburgh Society with us. That is how our bushes look in the spring. I know my good friend Andrew Hearn would laugh when he would see those pictures, and I don't think he would, could fathom that the bushes could grow into what they could by summertime when he saw those pictures. We commonly got below zero, usually 10 mornings a year in upstate New York, so we had to do harsh pruning in the spring. And then the picture on the left is my son Christian before a rose meeting in Syracuse. I would usually swing by and pick up municipal compost. Fantastic stuff. I would carry it home via the car, but those Tupperware 17-gallon containers. I could do that. I could apply compost pretty much to every bush by hand in terms of not hiring a truck to dump it or having to transport it and pay for somebody else to do it. I don't even have a pickup truck, just had a Civic at the time. I could do that maintenance. It was attainable because I had a small amount of roses. Maintenance certainly includes spraying. Picture on the right is how I dress for spraying. Gloves, long sleeves, hat, goggles, and a double respirator. Picture on the left is my daughter Kaylee covering up some plants in the spring when we had a late freeze. At 30 roses, or might be 5 or 10 for you for a small garden. You could probably come up with those amount of containers. At 300, probably not. Spraying. My spraying, wouldn't take very long when I had a smaller amount of roses because I did not need as much spray material. It's a good point to emphasize this down south. I have about the same number of roses, 38 or so hybrid teas right now, but it takes me about twice as long to spray because they're almost twice as big. So rethinking things, maybe I did not need the same numbers down south as I did up north because they're twice as big. So that's something to consider that, hey, if you've got 10 bushes on something like a Fortuniana, a southern rootstock, and they're growing 5, 6, 7 feet tall, that is a lot of roses. So you don't need the quantity as much due to how large they grow down here. Up north, I like showing these pictures because they remind me of how cold winter can be. That's me on the left. Whenever we did get a snow, I would use a snow blower to snow blow onto the roses because snow is an excellent insulator of snow. On the right, my youngest son Matthew in the upper right, and then Christian and Kaylee helping shovel up the leaves. In our neighborhood, I had one deciduous tree and it didn't drop a lot of leaves. And they collected leaves in bags, paper bags in our neighborhood. I would go around and collect 20 or 30 of them, dump the leaves in my driveway, chop them up with an old mower, and then apply that around the base of the rose. So we usually would plant the crown or the bud union of the rose below the ground, but this would, along with any snow we got, further insulate it from those 10 mornings that would drop below zero. One of the best reasons to do a smaller garden, your wife or significant other, happy wife, happy life. I know my wife did not believe me in the beginning when I said that I just wanted a couple rose bushes, even though, again, I did not have an interest in rose shows. She knew based on how much my father got into it that the yard could get out of control. So I constantly talked to her about which ones to add and how many, and every time I wanted to expand, she kept that number down. So believe me, I wanted more than 38, 39 roses, but she kept that number low. And in hindsight, again, the wife is always right. Looking back, it was better I had a smaller amount. She's doing the same thing here in North Carolina, making sure that while it's a big hobby, takes up a lot of time, and I love it, to not get too crazy and cover up the whole yard with roses. Some advantages: less weeding. I know from experience, weeds can get out of control. If you have less surface area to grow roses, you have less surface area for weeding. Weeding is always going to be a pain. It's certainly nice to have less of an area to have to be concerned with. If you do rose shows, a lot of times we like to cover our blooms with these large jugs to protect them from dew or raindrops that can spot the bloom. Um, I can cover my roses, most of the good roses, because I don't have as many. So that's a big advantage specifically with regards to shows. You are eligible for some small garden awards. This is the President's Trophy that I won when I won Queen back in 2015 at the National Show. You are eligible for that usually if you're 50 bushes or less. I know the local society in Syracuse had a category for that with their spring show. It was a sweepstakes, large and small gardens. So sometimes even at the national level, you do not have to compete with the big boys in terms of large amounts of roses. Moonstone, Gemini, and Folklore were the lower left entries in this one. Less blooms to bring to the show makes travel easier. This is my Honda Civic. The lower left picture is definitely the Queen and then Cajun Moon. So that's how I showed up at the national show with these on the front seat, secure box. I usually use juice cartons and wax paper cones to bring them to the rose show, but you can see that I didn't have a big box. Certainly would maybe someday travel in something like a minivan, but for now, since I didn't have a lot of blooms, didn't need a big space. If you're thinking about shows, I mentioned space. Includes bringing other people to the shows. If you don't have a van or car full of roses, you can bring your daughter in this case. This was a table show where we show people at the local society what goes into exhibiting. And she was able to come, with me to a lot of the society meetings because I had plenty of room. It wasn't filled with roses. I mentioned preparing for the show, making it easier with regards to covering blooms. In the beginning, I stored most of my roses in the refrigerator. So often an exhibitor, a couple days before show, starts looking at promising blooms that would otherwise open up in the garden and be too open by show day. They'll put them in the refrigerator. At the time, it was a family refrigerator, and you can see the juice cartons and containers I used to hold them. So if you just have a few blooms, much easier to keep track of and prepare. Now, thanks to a nice coworker, I do have a separate fridge to contain these. I still hand water each of my roses and I fertilize by buckets. Really want to be precise. I'll talk about rainwater here in a second, but on the lower left, Sun Christian's filling up some of the buckets. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And each one was about 4 gallons. So that's about a gallon per bush. I would put a quarter cup of fish emulsion and Miracle-Gro, and that would work out to a tablespoon per gallon. Could I get a Siphon-X and have a system that pulled in a concentrated solution? Of course, that certainly would have saved time. But my feeling was, since I had such a small amount of roses, I wanted to make sure that each bush was getting exactly a gallon, or so, but they were getting that rate of a tablespoon per gallon. I was concerned if the rate of the pressure in my hose dropped off, or the length of the hose, that some roses would be getting more or less than I wanted. And since the number was low, I could actually fertilize by hand versus using like a siphon. Smaller number of roses, easier to find the ideal location. This is with regards to space. My yard in New York had a lot of mature trees. There was one part of the yard that was flat, got 6 hours of sunlight, and did not have competition from tree roots. If I tried to squeeze 100 roses in that location, a lot of those roses would be on the outskirts of them, would not be in an ideal location. So smaller number, easier to fit into the most ideal location in your yard or landscape. I mentioned less roses to water or fertilize. In New York, I primarily use just rainwater. This is Christian when he was much younger with just 2 barrels. These were 55-gallon drums. I went up to 4 and eventually had a utility pump hooked up with it, a wireless clicker, so I could turn it on and off. And outside of a 3 or 4 week period of dry weather one summer, primarily used just rainwater, much better than something treated like the city with fluoride. If I had 100 roses, this would not be possible. At 30, 38, 39, this was possible, and that was just about an inch or two of natural water a month, which was, near our average. I think we averaged 2 to 3 inches per month. So as long as we had an average rainfall, not even excessive, I had plenty of rainwater because the quantity was so low. Think as you watch this video, hey, if you just have 5 or 10 roses, that's very doable with how much rain we get around here in terms of strictly using just rainwater. I really try to stress the quantity over quality. Even at 38, 39, you start to lose track of things a little bit. But I can still put a lot more attention into it than if I had 100 or 200. And what I mean by that is pruning, disbudding, spraying. I can focus on the quality of the blooms because the quantity is lower. If you ever have to move or downsize your garden, it's much easier. When I did move from upstate New York to North Carolina, I sold all but 3 of my roses to the Syracuse Rose Society. It still took 3 trips up there. It still was a lot of work, but it was doable because I didn't have more than I really could grow. You can see from this picture I was able to dig them up, still keep the root structure, and wrap them in plastic. Some of these, they made it to everybody's yard, and most survived from what I was told, and some have gone on to win awards at future rose shows. So that was very nice to hear. A rose garden looks great at a yard. It may look good to people buying a house, but when it comes down to are they actually going to maintain it or even want it, probably not. So it was better just to dig them up, give them to a good home or sell them to a good home where I know they would continue to prosper, and let the new owners have the grass back to do with what they wanted. Definitely a sad picture. This is the rose garden after they were all taken out, so you can see just regular bushes along the side. I did leave knockout roses. They are definitely a beautiful landscaping rose. And then Yolande de Aragon, gold medal, and I think a signature were the 3 that were left along the deck. You can see behind the garage was where I had a composting facility. There are some disadvantages. You can't test the latest and greatest new roses. You really have to stick to the top roses. So that's why I have Geminis and Veterans Honors. Some of the newer ones I have to really let be tested by others before I give it that space, since it's so delicate. And then in terms of rootstock variety, you want to grow the best that grows in your area. So for us, with the sandy soil, Fortuniana does well to resist the nematodes. Up north, it was Multiflora. So I had to, if I got something on Dr. Huey or something that didn't do as well, I tried to get it over onto the appropriate rootstock because I did not have room for doubles and triples, except if it was the very, very best. It does limit the variety with regards to different classifications. I grow only hybrid teas. The exception would be one old garden rose, Yolande de Aragon. It won some Dowager Queens for me, and my son really loves it. So I kept that one. But I just don't even look at minis or mini floras. They don't interest me as much, but I just don't have the room for it when I'm just sticking to that one classification. And I do try to double up on a Gemini or Moonstone. We're talking a top 3 rose. But I cannot do what some exhibitors do, where they double and triple up on all the top 10, 15, 20 roses. And by doing that, they have a better chance to have those blooms at the rose show. You definitely have less to bring to the show. If you've ever seen me at a show, I'm not going to have the most blooms. I remember a couple friends were laughing at me at the last show I did in Syracuse in spring of 2016. I had 3 blooms. 2 Crescendo and 1 Alina. Entered the Crescendo at 1 Queen, the Alina won King, and the other Crescendo won, I think, Open Vase or Open Bowl. So I don't have a lot, but again, quality over quantity. Your pruning strategy is impacted, and what I mean by that, the prior slide I mentioned, I can't plant 3 or 4 of one variety, and in that case, folks would prune 1 week, then the next, and then maybe the following one. So they would have a 3-week window that they would have blooms coming from that specific variety. I pretty much have to pick the date of the show and work backwards and just aim for that week with 1 bush. It's doable, but you're definitely not going to have as many show roses to bring. So as you strategize, if you're somebody that has any interest in a show, I really encourage it. I think it's the lifeblood of new members. You don't have to be crazy competitive. All we're doing is showing folks in the community what can grow where we live, that these outstanding roses with some care and love, we know it takes a long time, can grow in our area. So if you have somebody and you only have a couple rose bushes and you want to expand, think about what you want to do. Maybe you want to stick to 10 or 15 because you have a lot of things going on in your life, and that is a number that you can maintain. Maybe just focus on hybrid teas. Maybe just focus on minis, and you have a patio deck and you just want them in pots. Stick to what you want, what you think you can handle in terms of weeding and fertilizing and spraying, doing the whole 360, that you can do it all, and keep the number low because you can't be everything to everybody. With regard to that, you definitely want to grow the rootstock that works best in your area. So Fortuniana down here, if you're watching from farther away, it could be Dr. Huey, or it could be Own Root or Multiflora. Really focus on that bed location. If you read any of the ARS literature, it's location, 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 5-6 hours plus of sunlight, away from tree competition and roots. And only order and plant the best roses. There's roseshow.com. Bob Martin runs that website. You can see the top roses. They haven't changed much. If you have some of those ARS annuals, Matt Colas, a good friend of mine from the Syracuse Society, gave me all his old ARS magazines, and from the 2000s on, the Geminis, Veterans Honors, and the Moonstones haven't moved much. So you don't have to have a huge variety, and you can know what to buy if you just look at that top 10 or 15 list and pick only the best. I hope you found this video useful. It's not just for exhibitors. I do want to encourage folks that are watching and saying, I only have 2 and I have 0 interest in a show. I encourage you to buy another rose bush or 2, enter a show. You may be bitten by the bug like I was, and now you're driving 4 and 5 hours through the night to get to a show. It's not just about competition. It's a lot about the social aspect. You'll meet some of the most nicest people you've ever met. So I hope this encourages you that you don't have to have hundreds. 5, 10, 15, or 30 plus like me is more than enough to do it. If you like this video and you have any questions, erichayden1@gmail.com. I'll try to get back to you. Again, erichayden1@gmail.com, and this is on YouTube as well, so you can view it and go back over any parts that you may not understand. Thank you very much for watching.